Morning. It's good to be with you. I think Pastor Joe's prayer just said it all about what's going on in the world right now. I mean, I can't think of another prayer where there's just so many things going on at the same time, but it's such a joy to be with this community. I think the greatest privilege of being able to preach for this church right now is just that I get to be in the same room with about 10 of you. It seems like the group gets a little bit bigger every time we meet as coronavirus calms down a little bit, but it's just a delight to be with you and to be able to share this word today. About a month ago, I preached on the story of Daniel's friends. We talked about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and how they refused to bow before an idol that Nebuchadnezzar had set up, and they remained firm in their faith, even to the point of death, even when they were thrown into this burning furnace that Nebuchadnezzar had prepared for those who would disobey. We talked about how Daniel's friends were not just an example of resistance in the Babylonian exile, thousands of years ago, but they're a model for how we as Christians should view our lives today, especially for those of us who are racial minorities experiencing a sense of alienation in this country. Exile is the experience of all Christians in the midst of a broken and fallen world, but it's a special perspective for those who have felt very personally the effects of racial upheaval and injustice that we've experienced as a country over the last months. Today's message is a kind of part two. It's a sequel to my earlier message, where now I want to focus not just on what it means to resist in exile, but what it means to construct a life in exile. The first message was how to respond to injustices. What do you do in the face of direct and immediate abuses of power and authority? Today I want to take a longer view and say, okay, we are in exile. What are we supposed to do while we're here? What's our mindset? What are our goals? What is our hope? What should we be investing in? And our passage today comes from Jeremiah 29, which is a very famous text. Many of you may be especially familiar with verse 11, which says, "For I know the plans I have for you, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future." I would hear that verse all the time in college, especially when it was midterms or finals week. Everybody had big papers due. When people were feeling very stressed, people would always share Jeremiah 29:11. But you see Jeremiah 29 in a lot of other places too. Some of you may remember Jonathan Brooks, who has spoken at our church and speaks very often for the CCDA. And he's got this book called Church Forsaken. And if you read it, it's basically just an exposition on Jeremiah 29. The subtitle of the book is Practicing Presence in Neglected Neighborhoods. And every chapter focuses on one verse or one phrase from Jeremiah 29 to show how this passage applies to Chicago. One chapter focuses on building houses from verse 5. And so it talks about housing. Another one talks about planting gardens in this co-op and grocery store that they built out in Englewood. And so this passage has inspired, one of the best CCDA books out there, and it's written especially about Chicago, what it means to build houses and plant gardens in Chicago. My favorite theologian, as you probably know, is Augustine, and his greatest work is City of God. That's a book that I read over and over again. And it's interesting that in City of God, Jeremiah 29 is his favorite passage for explaining what it means to be a Christian in this broken world. He gets the title of his book from Psalm 46, verse 4, which was our reading for today. "There is a river whose streams make glad the city of God, the holy place where the Most High dwells." That's Psalm 46, verse 4. What he says is, we Christians are that city of God. We are that holy place where God dwells. We are the city of God. We're the heavenly city. But we live in the earthly city. We live in the city of man. We are God's Jerusalem, but we live in Babylon. We're stuck here. And our awareness that we're stuck here should teach us to order our days. It should make us learn what it means to love God and neighbor in the midst of our enemies and in the midst of hostility and oppression. Coach asked me to preach a couple months ago, and he said, "You're going to get two sermons." And he asked me to think about maybe how they would go together. The first passage that came to my mind was Jeremiah 29. I don't think actually I've ever preached on this passage before. And as I was writing the sermon, I realized I could have done both sermons on this passage. I could have done a whole series really on this passage. So it's a joy to be with you, to be able to share a word from this passage today. And I want to invite you to join with me as we listen to God's word for us from this word that Jeremiah gave to the Israelites. I want to study this passage by asking three questions. Why does this passage matter? What does this passage command? And what does this passage promise us? Why does this passage matter? What does it command? And what does it promise us? I'm going to begin a few verses earlier to Jeremiah 29, verses 1 through 3, where it says, "This is a text of the letter that the prophet Jeremiah sent from Jerusalem to the surviving elders among the exiles, and to the priests, the prophets, and all the other people Nebuchadnezzar had carried into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon." This is a text that Jeremiah sent from Jerusalem. So he's still in Jerusalem, but he's writing a letter to the people who have gone over to exile, to the surviving elders, to the priests, to the prophets, and all the other people who are now in a different land. So it's a long-distance letter from Jerusalem off to this foreign land where everybody's been sent. This is after King Jehoiakim and the queen mother, the court officials, and the leaders of Judah and Jerusalem, the skilled workers and the artisans had gone into exile from Jerusalem. He entrusted the letter to Elasah, son of Shaphan, and to Gemariah, son of Hilkiah, whom Zedekiah, king of Judah, sent to Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon. So the passage in front of us is not a normal passage. It's a passage of very special significance. Jeremiah is called the weeping prophet because he's the main prophet who warns Jerusalem about the attack by Babylon just as it's about to happen. And he lives through it. Now, there's other prophets who had talked about this, but some of them were in the northern tribes, very far away from Jerusalem. Others of them lived a long time, centuries before this event would happen. Jeremiah is a prophet who is based in Jerusalem, the capital of Israel, the main place that's going to get destroyed with the temple and the altar and everything, all the other stuff. And he is a prophet who lives through the destruction of the temple and the city itself. It's as if he were living in New York City, and he had been predicting for years and years and years that 9/11 would happen. And then it did happen while he was still living in New York City, just 2 blocks away from the Twin Towers, and he watched the whole thing unfold before his eyes, which he told everybody all along was going to happen. He was right on the scene, and he lived through everything as if it happened. And because this was such a special task, God had to call Jeremiah to it in a very special way. That's why Jeremiah 1:5 says, "Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I set you apart. I appointed you as a prophet to the nations." Because God knew this is a very, very difficult task. It was a very special moment. He had to set that person apart from the womb for this very important job. And the rest of Jeremiah's life is marked by much hardship. He's accused of being a traitor and of being disloyal to Israel because he's predicting their destruction. He's accused of being a false prophet. He's accused of rooting for the Babylonians over the Israelites. And he's persecuted many times. He's put into the stocks where he's humiliated. He's thrown into a cistern, this giant pit, where he has to suffer hunger and thirst and isolation. But then his words come true. Nebuchadnezzar does come. He does destroy Jerusalem, and the king, and the priests, and the prophets, and all the other citizens are carried away into a foreign land. And now there they are, plunked into this foreign land, among a foreign people, in a situation of utter domination, their lives in total chaos and disarray. They don't know how long they're going to be there. They don't know how they will be treated. They don't know whether they'll get to go home or whether they're going to stay there for a good while. And it's at this point that Jeremiah receives another word from the Lord to share with those who have just landed in captivity. That's our passage. This time they're ready to pay attention because everything Jeremiah said was going to happen just happened. They know now that Jeremiah was telling them the truth the whole time, that he wasn't a false prophet, that he had been hearing from God after all. And now Jeremiah is telling them instructions. He's giving them instructions on where they are and what to expect, and he's giving them a kind of orientation on their new lives in exile. He's orienting them to their surroundings. My school year has just started. Our academic year has just started, and Wheaton is in person. Most of the students have come back to campus. We've got all these new first-year students who have just shown up, straight out of high school, and the first thing they go through when they come on campus is orientation. It's very different this year because they're all wearing masks, and they have to do the orientation outside, and they're sitting 6 feet away from each other and all this stuff. But they still have to go through orientation because this is such a new development for them. This is their first time on a new campus. They're living away from home for the first time. They don't have their parents to help them walk through things. Maybe some of them don't even know how to do their own laundry. So there's this whole team, this whole orientation team that puts together an orientation week. They say, here are the important things you need to know about Wheaton. This is where your classes are. This is where the buildings are. This is what your professors are going to expect of you. This is where you should go if you get sick or you need help or you need support. And that is exactly what Jeremiah is doing for the Israelites in their new situation. He's telling them where they are, what they should be doing, and what God has planned for them. And one of the most important things that he says is, y'all are going to be here for a while. It's going to be 70 years. Now, that's an interesting number because he's saying it's pretty long, but it's also not permanent. You're going to be here for a while, but not forever. So on the one hand, you're not going to get killed out here. Nebuchadnezzar is not plotting genocide against all the Israelites. Your children's children will return to their homeland someday. But you're also not going home right away. Don't expect the king to have some sudden change of heart where suddenly he says, you know what, I made a mistake, I'm just going to send you back home, I don't need you here. You're going to be here for a minute, and you need to prepare for that reality. Now, as Christians have seen throughout history, this passage is more than just a word to the Israelites in Babylon thousands of years ago. It is that. It is a story about that specific situation and God's promise that they will return home. But it's also a spiritual picture of what life is like for all Christians now as we suffer the pain and the brokenness of this world around us. 70 years is a very symbolic number in the Bible. It's 7 times 10. And both 7 and 10 you find in lots of places in the Bible where it signifies something like wholeness or completion or perfection. You know, God dedicated the 7th day to rest as a Sabbath day. When Jesus is asked, how many times must I forgive my brother or sister who sins against me? He says, 7 times 70, right? Basically forever. As many times you get sinned against, that's how many times you forget. That's Matthew 18. In the book of Revelation, we have these letters to these churches, like Ephesus and Smyrna and Laodicea, and there's 7 letters to the churches in Turkey. 10 is also a symbolic number. You see it in the 10 plagues against Egypt. You see it in the 10 commandments that God gives to Israel. You see lots of 10s in Jesus' parables and in stories in the gospel. 10 leopards or 10 virgins or 10 talents. All sorts of 10s all over the place. And when you put them together, the point is to show us that this passage has spiritual significance. It's not just meant to tell the Israelites how to number their days until they're released from Babylon. It's a passage meant for us today, for all God's people, to count their years until they're released from this broken world, which is not the way things are supposed to be. It's a picture for our life in this world. The Bible teaches us that God created the world good, and that we are meant for perfect fellowship with God and with our neighbors. That relationship with God was supposed to be peaceful and harmonious. If we kept that right, our relationship with our neighbors would also be peaceful and harmonious. But Adam and Eve fell, and all of humanity has now been plunged into this horrible mess. Humanity has become a relentless series of conflicts and wars. Our day-to-day lives are consumed by cruelty and chaos and poverty and disease and death and all the things that Pastor Joe was praying about. Now, some of this is our doing. Some of this is our fault because we have not been right before God. But we also feel that there is something wrong about what we're experiencing, that humans are not meant to live like this, that God meant for us something better than this world that we're experiencing right now. And the Bible teaches us, you're right. You are meant for something better. I don't want you just to be in misery. This is not where you're supposed to be forever. You're in exile. You're going through a time of discipline and testing and refining and chastisement. But someday this will be over. Someday you will return home. There is a day that Jesus will return, and you will be restored with your resurrection bodies into perfect fellowship with me and perfect fellowship with all of humanity in perfect unity as you gaze upon my face. God has not forgotten you. God will bring you home. God will bring you back to himself, That's God's message to Jeremiah, and that's God's message to us today. Why is this passage important? Because it's an orientation for life in this world. It teaches us how to view our surroundings. It teaches us how to interpret what's going on around us. And it teaches us that we're not meant for what we're going through right now. We're going through a temporary period of discipline and testing, but it will not last forever. God has not forgotten us, and we will return home. All right, what does this passage command us? Let's take a look at verses 4 through 7. This is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says to all those I carried into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. Build houses, settle down, plant gardens, and eat what they produce. Marry and have sons and daughters. Find wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage, so that they too may have sons and daughters. Increase in number there, do not decrease. Also, seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I have carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper. The first command Jeremiah gives to the Israelites is to build houses. There's something about a house that communicates permanence. It communicates you're going to be there for a while. It's different from living in a tent or some kind of temporary shelter. To build a house means you lay a foundation. It means you build walls of brick and mortar. It means you frame up walls. It means you set a roof on top of that structure. And it's more than that, though. It's not just the building materials. It's not just all the labor. A house represents stability. It represents a place you can call your home. It's a base for growing a family and carving out a life for yourself and contributing to your community around you. And that's what God commands the Israelites to do. As you see in the rest of the verses, what are the other commands? They all communicate this kind of mentality. You're going to be here for a while, so get used to it. Verse 5, it says, settle down. Set up your surroundings in preparation that you're going to be here for a while. And it goes on, plant gardens and eat what they produce. Well, gardens take sort of a while. You have to prepare the soil. You got to plant the seeds. You got to wait for your produce to grow. Set up a garden because you're going to be here for a while. Marry and have sons and daughters. Find wives for your sons. Give your daughters in marriage so that they too may have sons and daughters. So he's saying, think intergenerationally. You get married, then get your kids married. They did arranged marriages back then. Then wait for your kids to themselves, get married and to have their grandchildren. 70 years is long enough for you to get married and have kids, and for your kids to get married and have kids. Then verse 7, seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I've carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper. You're going to be here long enough that you should be civically engaged. You're going to be here long enough that you have an interest in making sure that Babylon is doing civically and politically well. If Babylon goes through some kind of budget crisis, that's going to be your budget crisis. If Babylon suffers high rates of unemployment, that could affect your job. If Babylon has very high rates of crime, that could affect your life too. Pray for the city, because if it prospers, you too will prosper. Now, Jeremiah's advice is very confusing, because there are two things that he's teaching here. The first is that the Israelites are only going to be in exile for a short time before God restores them back to the land, and they will experience prosperity and peace again. The other is that the Israelites are going to be in exile for a pretty long time, such that they should settle in and build houses and plant gardens and produce a family. So you wonder, which one is it? Are we here for a long time or a short time? Should we focus on how it's temporary or how it's sort of long? And the answer is that we need to pay attention to both. We're not going back tomorrow, but we are going back eventually. Our stay here is temporary, but it's long enough that we need to invest in it and to get settled in. And it sort of reminds me, actually, of the coronavirus. When this thing first began in March, or whenever it was that we had lockdown, we didn't know how long it would last. We didn't know if it was going to be a few weeks, a few years, or even longer. People were making runs on the stores, right? So you couldn't even find a grocery around here that had toilet paper or hand sanitizer or tissues or whatever else. We had worries about shortages, like supply line shortages, where you might not be able to get your meat and your eggs or your milk or whatever else. But after a while, you have to settle into your life. Becomes the new normal. This becomes your reality. And you do not want this to last forever, and you're keeping in your head that someday there's going to be a vaccine, and we're hoping it happens sooner than later, but we don't exactly know when, and so for now, we just have to adjust to our situation. We have to establish our rhythms. We got to figure out how we're going to make this situation work for ourselves. And it's sort of funny how this worked out for Jeanette and me during this time, because like many of you, when this, shelter in place was put into action, our first response was just to survive. It was sort of like, oh my gosh, our kids aren't going to school anymore. What do we do? Like, how do we make sure that they're still doing their homework? Like, what are the teachers going to tell us what to do? Where is Jeanette going to do work? She can't meet with clients in person now, so we got to, figure out like a place where she can even sit and look at her computer. How are we going to balance our work schedules? So everybody's just sort of freaking out the first couple of weeks, just trying to figure day to day, how are we going to get our groceries? What are we going to? What are we not going to? How do we sustain ourselves? And after a while, we had been there for sort of a long time. We'd been in the situation for a long time. The two things that we decided to do were to build a house and to build a garden. So we didn't build our own house for us to live in, but I built a chicken coop. And it took me like a month to build that chicken coop. It's a beautiful little house for these chickens. You can see them, in our backyard if you want. We have these 6 chickens, and they're just starting to lay little eggs. And then Jeanette wanted some garden beds, so we built a couple of those too. We did exactly what this passage said, because once you're settling in, you sort of want to, build something and plant a garden. And we figured, we don't want to be here forever, but if we're going to be here for a while, we sort of want our own eggs and we want our own vegetables. We might as well, because we got nothing else to do. We're just staying at home. Now, as I shared, I've been thinking a lot more about exile in light of the racial injustices of the recent months. I think that there's a special way in which this exile is not just about the Christian life, but it says something to racial minorities. And we're all aware of everything that's been going on with the deaths of unarmed African Americans at the hands of police officers and all the protests and the riots and the looting that have followed. I've been on sabbatical this whole time, and I was already spending a lot of time reading about race. So when these incidents happened, they just sort of connected with me in a different way. And my reading just weighed on me because it made me realize how challenging these issues are and how deeply seated this country's problems with race go. And I just want to share with you some things that I've been thinking about in that regard and how I think it affects our community. One of the most powerful books I read on this topic was called White Flight by a professor named Kevin Kruse. He's a professor of history at Princeton University. And he does a study on how white flight unfolds in Atlanta, which is sort of an interesting place to study because, first of all, it's in the South. And usually when you think about these, white flight from urban centers, you're thinking about northern cities. And the other thing is that Atlanta is often considered to be a model, a positive model of what integration can look like. It had this motto for itself called "the city too busy to hate." Okay? The attitude was basically, you have all these problems up in Chicago, you have all these problems up in Detroit and these other northern cities, but down here in Atlanta, we're pretty good. Our black folks and white folks get along with each other, and this is a place where blacks can do very well. And as the book shows, as he really studies this time period, he goes from the 1940s and 50s and 60s, he says, you know what, this situation was a lot more complicated than you think. And he walks step by step through how white flight happened as black folks started integrating white spaces. And it's a very, very interesting story that I want to share a little bit with you about. In the early 1900s, black folks were confined to some of the most overcrowded, under-maintained, and overpriced neighborhoods in the city. But many of them did have stable jobs, and they wanted to move to a more spacious place in a more stable neighborhood where they could provide a better life for their families. What that meant back then was that they had to move into white neighborhoods. But as soon as they did, they would immediately face resistance. And it's very interesting to show how this resistance unfolds and how it takes different forms as you move up the classes, as you move up the ranks from poorer whites to richer whites, from lower income whites to upper income whites, from lower class whites to upper class whites. The first forms of racism that blacks face as they integrate communities is from the most flamboyantly and blatantly and obnoxiously racist groups like the KKK. It's your straight white supremacists. And they come right at blacks by bombing their homes, attacking them on the streets, burning a cross in their front yard. Most white folks find this extreme, even embarrassing, and they don't want to be associated with them. And yet, as blacks move into more mainstream white communities, they still meet hostility at every step, but it looks a little bit different. In the 1940s in Atlanta, integration begins at the level of housing and public spaces, things like public transportation, pools, parks. And the population that's most affected is white working class folks. Lower class whites, working class whites, they're the ones who are the most affected and they resist. In the 1950s, the dispute shifts to schools. And then it's a white middle class that gets very upset and wants to pull their kids out of school or wants to redraw school lines, this kind of thing. In the 1960s, the dispute shifts to businesses and segregated lunch counters and all the sit-ins and protests that we're familiar with in the civil rights movement. And this affects upper-class whites because they are the ones who own the businesses. So it sort of goes from the KKK to, working-class whites to middle-class whites to upper-class whites. And as the disputes shift from space to space, the language whites use to resist racial integration changes. The KKK is the worst, but they are also the most honest. They'll just say, straight up, I hate black people, I want them dead. That's honest. When you get to more mainstream whites, they'll say, we aren't racist, we got nothing against black folks. We just want to preserve the integrity of our communities. We believe in freedom of association. We think that people should get to choose where they live and what schools they go to and what businesses they participate in without government interference. We're for freedom, not racism. We're not racist. We just believe freedom of association, community integrity, freedom from government interference. Then the trickiest ones are the upper-class whites. I probably shouldn't even preach this part of the sermon. I'll repent later, but I can't. It's just so interesting. They are very, very tricky. But they're the ones who claim to support racial progress. And they condemn lower-class whites for being racist. They're like, oh, look at those racist rural folks over there. Why aren't they more open-minded? Why aren't they more progressive? But quietly, they're the ones sending their kids to all-white private schools. They're the ones moving to wealthy suburbs where minorities cannot afford to live. And they feel very comfortable supporting integration politically because they know it's not going to affect them personally at all. But as soon as there's a tiniest whiff, the tiniest little suggestion about redrawing school district lines where minorities might start coming to your schools, establishing bus lines or train lines, commuter lines to connect different racial communities, to change a zoning law that might permit the construction of affordable housing in a wealthy white suburb, ooh, that is when their inner racist comes out, and they will kick and claw and scream and do everything that they can to keep people of color out of their communities. Now, all this happened in the 1950s and 60s, so, we could maybe think things are different now. Makes you a little wary, though. Makes you just a little bit suspicious when you see all these very wealthy corporate types, these very privileged white liberals who claim to support Black Lives Matter. You just sort of wonder, are they really in solidarity with black folks? And what would it be like if people of color really started coming into their neighborhoods and their schools? Would they feel the same way? There's a term that we use today. It's called NIMBYism, not in my backyard, N-I-M-B-Y. Oh, I support racial progress, but not in my backyard. There's another term that we use. It's called virtue signaling. It means I show my virtue. I show that I'm woke. I show that I'm progressive, but it's just a symbol. It's just a signal. It's not something you're really committed to. The Bible's term for this is deception and hypocrisy and self-righteousness, and that is the history that we've seen in this country. When I think about these dynamics and realize how difficult it is to overcome people's biases and prejudices, and how many systems and laws and practices and procedures are stacked against the equitable distribution of resources across race lines, including Chicagoland, it just makes you feel very discouraged. It makes you realize how challenging these kinds of issues are. And I'm not saying that all white people are racist, including not, white privileged liberals are not all racist. I'm not saying that there's no exceptions, to these rules. and there's no value in working with suburban communities. Of course, there are many situations where that can be a positive thing. But after a while, when you read this history, it sort of makes you wonder, going in that direction might just be banging your head against the wall. You might not get very far with these kinds of efforts to do these partnerships or to persuade white folks to open up the doors so that there's resources for everybody. And so the other option that I think a lot about and that really excites me is the option of rebuilding where you're at. For rebuilding here, where you are right now, under the leadership of local leaders. Some of you may have seen this Facebook post by Richard Townsend, who heads our development corporation in the wake of the protests after George Floyd. This post hit me like a ton of bricks, and I've been sharing about it a lot in a lot of different places. Many of you might have heard me talk about this before. And it presents a vision for the kinds of things that I think we should be investing in here, a vision for the way that we should be approaching community development here in Lawndale. He begins this post by talking about the kinds of things he thinks don't make that big of a difference, that are valuable in and of themselves, but are not the full solution, where we need to think bigger. Voting. It's good to vote. We should all vote in November. But you're also just filling out a bubble, and you only do it a couple of years, and every couple of years, and if that's all you're doing, you're not very engaged in the life of your community. That's not civic engagement. That's just the lowest possible thing that you can do. Protests and marches, those are valuable in that they express public sentiment. They communicate what issues people care about, and that gets the attention of people who are higher up. But if you can have a very emotional protest, and a lot of people come out, if it doesn't translate into concrete action, the same thing's going to happen over and over and over again. You need to translate that into sustainable solutions. Service projects, like cleaning up glass after the looting, or planting flowers, these are also important for communities, but they don't address the social and economic injustices that generate these racial outrages in the first place. And I was sort of feeling bad, because that's the kind of stuff that I did. I don't know what else I'm supposed to be doing. Then he talks about what he sees as a more positive solution, as a more robust solution, something that's stronger and more sustainable, that will really make a difference. And he talks about the recently formed North Lawndale Homeowners Association, which I think was formed just a few years ago. And the major win that they had with the Frederick Douglass Library here, where they were able to organize and collectivize and secure $2.5 million to renovate that building with the support of then-Mayor Rahm Emanuel and Michael Scott, our alderman. Many of you may have also seen this WBEZ article, where Richard and others from the Homeowners Association share about how they secured a commitment from the mayor to build 1,000 affordable homes in the west side, and there's another commitment to build 1,000 affordable homes on the south side. This is a kind of thing that would actually make a difference. This is a kind of concrete, sustainable, deliverable work that is necessary to build up a community brick by brick. Voting's good, protests good, service projects are good, but we really need to think about systemic injustices and development and what's actually going to bring resources into this community. I attended my first Homeowners Association meeting just a couple months ago, and I was so impressed by the focus and the commitment, by the ownership of the members. There are a lot of church people who are on that Zoom call. It was Richard and Stephanie, Harry, who's co-president, and Rochelle, Karen Castleberry, who's one of the founders, Carl Paulson, Dale Terenga, and there are a few of us who started. I think that was our first meeting, for me, for Chelsea, for Deborah Brown, for Matt Cry. I mean, it was great to see the church folks out there. It was great also to be with the larger civic community who's not at our church, but has many of the same interests. I came out of that call thinking, man, this is the kind of work that Jeremiah is calling for in this passage. This is the kind of thing that he's calling the Israelites to pursue while they're in exile, and it's the kind of work that we should be supporting as a church. What do you do in exile when you're facing brokenness and injustice and despair? Jeremiah says, build houses, plant gardens, develop a future for your children and your children's children. And you do so knowing that God does not forget about his people, that God has plans to bring us peace and prosperity, and that he is behind this work as you pursue it. What does this passage command? It commands us to build houses in captivity, and that's what we should be doing in our community as well. Lastly, what does this passage promise us? Verses 10 through 14. This is what the Lord says: when 70 years are completed for Babylon, I will come to you and fulfill my good promise to bring you back to this place. Here's a famous verse. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Plans to give you hope and a future. Then when you will call on me and come and pray to me, and I will listen to you. You will seek me and find me when you seek me with all your heart. I will be found by you, declares the Lord, and will bring you back from captivity. I will gather you from all the nations and places where I've banished you, declares the Lord, and will bring you back to the places from which I carried you into exile. It is a very famous and familiar passage, but because it's so familiar, it's easy to just sort of pass it by and to miss its impact. We should not underestimate how powerfully these words would have hit the Israelites at this time. They have just arrived against their will in Babylon, been forced against their will into this foreign land. They've suffered starvation. They've been beaten, killed, burned, destroyed. They're in a foreign land surrounded by a foreign people speaking in a foreign language. And this is all predicted. Jeremiah and the prophets had warned the people over and over again that this would happen. Now this horrible thing has happened, and the people have to deal with the consequences. And the most natural thought in the world for them is, God hates us. God did this because he was angry with us, and now he has forsaken us forever. We are no longer God's chosen people. He has abandoned us to our enemies. He will never allow us to enjoy the light of day. He will never allow us to return to our own land, to our own culture, to our own customs, to our own way of life. And it's at that point that God says, stop. Just stop what you're saying right now. Stop saying I hate you. Stop saying I don't care about you. It was for your own good, Israel, that I chastised you. Your sins had gotten out of control. They were destroying you. They were disfiguring my image in you. They had turned you into a mockery and a parody of the community I called you to be. But none of that means I hate you. None of that means that I abandoned you. None of that means I left you to your enemies forever. After 70 years, when this time of chastisement is over, I will bring you back home. I will restore you to myself. You will be my people, and I will be your God. You will call upon me and pray to me and seek me, and I will listen to you, and I will hear your prayers, and I will allow myself to be found by you again. Verse 11, for I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future. This passage corresponds very closely to another passage that comes just a couple chapters later, Jeremiah 31, where God connects this promise to a new covenant. And says, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the people of Israel and the people of Judah. It will not be like the covenant I made with their ancestors when I took them by the hand to lead them out of Egypt, because they broke my covenant, though I was a husband to them, declares the Lord. This is a covenant I will make with the people of Israel after that time. I will put my law in their minds, write it on their hearts. I will be their God, and they will be my people. No longer will they teach their neighbor or say to one another, know the Lord, because they will all know me, from the least of them to the greatest, declares the Lord. For I will forgive their wickedness, and I will remember their sins no more. This passage about the new covenant, this new covenant where God will write the law on our hearts and on our minds, a new covenant different from the old covenant. The old covenant was something that we could break. The old covenant was laws written in stone that we kept violating and disobeying. This is a new covenant that's written in our hearts, in our minds, through the gift of the Holy Spirit. This is a very central passage to the Old Testament, and it is the basis of the letter to the Hebrews, which quotes this passage in full in chapter 8 and says, you know how this new covenant was established? It was established with a new priest, a new high priest, a new great high priest whose name is Jesus Christ. And chapter 8, verse 6 of Hebrews says, in fact, the ministry Jesus has received is as superior to theirs, to these Old Testament priests, as a covenant of which he is mediator, is superior to the old one, since the new covenant is established on better promises. We've got a better priest, a better covenant based on better promises. The days are coming when I will make a new covenant, declares the Lord, when I will put my law in their minds and write it on their hearts, because this new covenant will be founded on Jesus Christ, and it will be enacted through the Holy Spirit. In these New Testament times, we say, yes, you know what? We are still in exile. We do continue to suffer corruption and injustice and inequities of many kinds. But we see that God's word will not go unfulfilled. He did return the Israelites to Babylon after those 70 years. He did establish a new covenant through Jesus Christ, and he is continuing to work in his people now, with whom he has established a new covenant as we move forward to do the good works that God has called us toward. And God is still calling us now to build houses, to plant gardens, and to invest in those around us. It's precisely as we do so that we are hastening the day when we will call on our God, and he will hear us and be found by us and restore us to our heavenly homeland. That's why Hebrews 12 says this, therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles. Let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and the perfecter of our faith. Amen.
Thanks for watching one of the Lawndale Community Church messages. We would love for you to hit the subscribe button. Please always, if you like the message, hit the like button, and we're looking forward to your comments.